We are group seven, Zoe, Kiesha, and Morgan, and we were assigned the topic of mining in South Dakota. We will focus on the injustices of the American Indians in South Dakota.
So mining is the process of extracting materials from the earth. Different materials include metals, precious metals, and minerals. There's a lot of benefits to mining. First off, it includes or it provides us essential materials. Economy wise, there's a lot of job opportunities and it creates really good revenue. Per an estimate of 2020, the US mining industry is about $82 billion worth. So, it is quite the big revenue stream there. Despite these benefits, there's also a lot of negative impacts on the environment and human beings, specifically to the population of American Indians living in reservation land in South Dakota. These negative impacts lead to negative health effects and, moreover, discrimination. So there's a lengthy history, but I'm going to keep it really brief about how the American Indians and South Dakota and mining all tie together. Essentially, it started over land dispute, which then entered into the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which essentially relocated the Indian tribes to the Black Hills area of South Dakota specifically. This treaty worked for a little while until 1874, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills area by General Custer. Everyone rushed into the Black Hills because they wanted to stake their claim in the lands. At that point, the Indians fought back as it was, rightfully their land. The US eventually intervened and created the Act of 1877, which confiscated the Black Hills from the Indians. There's a lot of questions as to how this was legal and if it was legal. And today, current ownership of the Black Hills remains a legal dispute between the United States and the Indians. Despite all of this, the American Indian tribes, remain in South Dakota today. There are 9 reservations in South Dakota, and the American Indian population comprises about 8.5% of South Dakota's population. This might sound like a small number, but just because it's a small population, they are just as important as everyone else. So on to the negative health effects as an injustice. Many of these mining sites throughout Western America are located on or directly surround the tribal lands, and this is the case for the Indian Americans in South Dakota. As a result of mining over time, there is an increased risk of exposure to arsenic and uranium to those who live in these areas where these active and abandoned mines are. Both arsenic and uranium are natural elements found within our environment. A study by Faria et al. Explains that mining activity above all other natural phenomena increases arsenic concentration in the environment. And another study by George et al. Explains that chronic arsenic exposure has been associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, different cancers, and all-cause mortalities within the American Indian communities. So there's similar concerns when looking at the health effects from uranium exposure. Morgan will detail these out more so in her slide, but just briefly, decaying uranium turns into radon gases, and exposure to these gases can lead to lung cancer. Unfortunately, there is no way to extract uranium from rock without creating radioactive waste. So it is a big problem. We decided to look at this injustice through the social work grand challenge. The specific grand challenge that this injustice meets is that we need to create social responses to a changing environment. It's really important that these social responses are appropriate to the problem at hand, and to really understand that, we need to consider the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This document is very similar to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but more specific to the cultural needs of this population and Indigenous people in general. There were 2 articles that really stood out, Article 29 and 38, which essentially say, 28 says that the state should be helping with programs and stuff for maintaining and restoring the health of Indigenous people, and then 38 states essentially that the states need to take appropriate measures to make sure that the ends of this declaration are met. Unfortunately, in this case, neither of those articles are being met. So that's something really important to remember when trying to come with solutions for these problems.
All right, moving into the supporting evidence of discrimination. There has been a lot of water pollution surrounding the mining regions of South Dakota due to mining and a lack of protections in place. One example of that would be the gold mining. This caused arsenic release into water impacted sediments in the Cheyenne River, specifically of South Dakota. And there's water pollution all over the US based on these mining efforts. Specifically, another example would be in the Navajo Nation. There's elevated arsenic and uranium concentrate in their unregulated water sources as well. This water pollution has led to premature mortality rates and a lot of health issues among the American Indian people. Some leading causes of death are diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, much like Zoe mentioned earlier. And American Indians in South Dakota have higher mortality rates than any other nation, which I found to be very, very telling. Within the South Dakota population, 70% of American Indians died before reaching the age of 70, compared to only 25% of white people. Chronic disease was a leading cause of this premature mortality. And then on top of that, that's more of the indirect discrimination where the water pollution has led to their poor health, where they've also experienced a lot of blatant discrimination. More than 1 in 5 American Indians report experiencing discrimination in clinical encounters specifically. And also 15% avoided seeking health care for themselves or family members due to this anticipated discrimination. It's well known that discrimination and harassment are widely reported by American Indians across multiple domains of their lives, regardless of where they're from. And results of this study suggested that modern forms of discrimination and harassment against American Indians are systemic and untreated problems. There's a very large lack of access to high quality and timely health care amongst the American Indian people. There's insufficient funding, which leads to these delays and deficiencies in preventative care. And also, American Indian adults report a lower self-perceived physical health on top of their chronic diseases. So even they believe that they're not physically healthy. Moving into the policies and decisions relating to this discrimination, obviously there's a lack of regulation regarding water pollution in various American Indian locations. This is clear in, if you look specifically at the Navajo Nation, arsenic levels exceed national drinking water standards by over 15% and uranium by almost 13%. In South Dakota, the Cheyenne River watershed was impacted by the Homestake mine, specifically surrounding the Sioux tribe reservation, with incredibly high arsenic concentrations. Uranium has been found in the drinking water, which is a very overlooked public health crisis, being that it leads to different types of cancers, heart disease, and all kinds of increasingly horrendous health issues. There's also a current interest to open and reopen previous uranium mines, and that's due to the current increasing value of uranium mines, but obviously that would lead to a huge problem within the American Indian population. Luckily, despite all of this, there are a lot of strengths in the American Indian people, especially in their resisting of mining efforts, specifically in the Black Hills region. The Black Hills Alliance was built between Indigenous people and settlers to place regulations in mining to avoid contaminated drinking water. Specifically, members of the 5 Sioux tribes attended a meeting with the Inter-American Commissions on Human Rights to explain that their communities continue to suffer from this legacy of uranium mining. Lakota tribe members are currently advocating to prevent building of a 10,600 acre uranium mine within the Black Hills region. Very, very large mine, and obviously this would fail to account for the sacred nature of this site, thus violating the 1868 U.S. Lakota Treaty and federal environmental laws. However, if it does get turned around, this would be a huge legal win for the Lakota and would represent a huge victory of a tribe over large corporations, and it would really force federal regulators to protect these sites.
We're going to play a quick video that we just thought was very fitting to this, based off of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota.
Rash on her leg. She said the doctors did not know what that was caused from. And I looked at her and I told her it was from the water, and tears were coming out of her eyes and she was nodding. She said all of her neighbors passed away or they're dying currently. And that was 4 years ago, so that grandma has probably passed away now. So we need to stop this uranium mine because it affects everybody around us, no matter what color your skin or your fur is. No more rash on her leg. She said the doctors did not know what that was.
All right. Moving on.
Okay, so next, the social work connection to all of this. We clearly know that the American Indians are discriminated against, and there is a ton of social injustices within the population. But we wanted to point out the National Association of Social Work, the codes in which we should be following as social workers. They're listed are the core values. And then we just wanted to emphasize that one of the ethical responsibility to our clients, section 1.05, cultural competence and social diversity. So just kind of circling back to our last class when we talked about competency and how it almost seems impossible, but we need to try our best to understand these populations' cultures and be able to demonstrate competence in the provision of services that are sensitive to clients' culture and to differences among people and cultural groups. So that kind of ties into micro, meso, macro levels of practice. Specifically for micro, really just focusing on the individual and their autonomy, different things simply such as the language they speak or schools that they might attend. The meso level kind of moving up to families and communities and making sure the relationship aspect is really important to this population. And obviously macro level would be more of the policies and legislations and federal government taking action to stop the discrimination. I just wanted to touch base briefly on two of the studies that did have positive impacts. The Strong Heart Water study, basically the authors of the study are hopeful that global arsenic mitigation will be decreased, and then that program would be significant to the American Indian households within South Dakota. And secondly, a study by Carefoot and Winston of 2015 aimed to determine the usefulness of GIS mapping, which helped to detect radon gas, and that was very important since it's odorless and colorless in those communities.
All right, moving on to our incredibly necessary call to action. Some of the socially responsive efforts that we kind of discussed and thought of would be clinics to address individual needs, water mitigation systems, abandoned mine cleanup. Luckily, there are some positive interventions in place already with water mitigation and the work to reform the healthcare system. However, there still definitely remains a need for reform. There's a bit of a lack on meso and macro level involvement of social work, and there's also obviously a lack of cleanup if water is still contaminated. And this attempt to open and reopen uranium mines is a huge concern, as well as just the overall lack of concern for American Indian health. It's our job as social workers to resolve this, and hopefully with some of these efforts, it can get done.
So we hope you enjoyed our presentation. And here briefly is just our reference slides.